You reach up without thinking and touch your jaw. Maybe there's stubble there. Maybe you shaved this morning and your fingers just confirm the smoothness. An unconscious little check you do a dozen times a day. It takes less than a second. You've probably never once asked yourself why that hair is even there. Why your face, of all places, still grows something your arms and your back mostly gave up on hundreds of thousands of years before language as we know it existed. Because here's the strange part. You are, for all practical purposes, a naked animal. Every other primate on the planet is covered head to toe in fur. You are not. Your skin is exposed almost everywhere, a bare, sweating surface unlike almost anything else in the mammal kingdom. And yet somehow, in the middle of that full-body retreat from hair, your face, specifically if you're a man, your face held the line, kept growing, got thicker, coarser, more visible than almost anywhere else on your body. That's not a small inconsistency. That's two different evolutionary stories, colliding on the same 6 inches of skin. And the answer to why isn't nearly as simple as we didn't need fur anymore, but we kept beards because people like them. Neither half of that sentence is quite true, and the real explanation is stranger, older, and considerably less settled than it sounds. Picture East Africa, somewhere around 1.5 million years ago. The landscape has been opening up, forest thinning into grassland, trees giving way to long stretches of exposed earth and low scrub. And an early human ancestor, not yet us, but close enough to feel the same sun on the same kind of skin, is walking, not sprinting. Walking for hours, the way you'd have to if you were tracking an animal across open country with nothing but your own legs, your own eyes, and your own patience. The sun in equatorial Africa at midday is not gentle. It presses down with a kind of weight, and this ancestor is covered, like every other primate before it, in a coat of fur. Fur is an excellent insulator. That's precisely the problem. An insulator traps heat in, which is exactly what you don't want when your body is working hard and generating heat internally under a sun that's already baking you from the outside. A fur coat that keeps a fox warm through a European winter becomes a liability on an African savanna at noon, especially if the animal wearing it is covering miles on foot, hour after hour, day after day. Your body solved this the same way it solves almost everything. Brute biological trial and error repeated across hundreds of thousands of generations. Individuals who happened to sweat more efficiently and who happened to carry a little less insulating fur ran cooler. They could push harder, longer, without their internal temperature climbing into dangerous territory. Over enough generations, that small advantage compounded into something much larger. This is the leading explanation for why humans lost their fur. The thermoregulation hypothesis, developed most thoroughly by biological anthropologist Nina Jablonski. Bare skin lets sweat evaporate directly off the surface of the body instead of getting trapped and wasted inside a coat of hair, and humans turned out to be exceptional sweaters. Densely packed sweat glands spread almost everywhere across the body, capable of producing far more sweat relative to body size than any other primate alive. Bare skin was the price of admission for that cooling system to actually function the way it needed to. It's not the only idea researchers have proposed, and it isn't universally agreed upon. Evolutionary biologist Mark Pagel has argued that losing fur may have offered a second, entirely different benefit: fewer places for parasites to hide. A thick coat is a comfortable home for ticks, lice, and the diseases they carry. Strip the fur away, and you strip away the hiding spots along with it. These two explanations aren't necessarily competing for the same slot. They could both be true at once, working together. What researchers do agree on is this: hairlessness wasn't an accident, and it wasn't cosmetic. It solved a real, physical problem, one that could genuinely kill an individual who couldn't manage it. Here's the frustrating part for anyone trying to pin down exactly when this happened. Skin doesn't fossilize. There's no ancient body lying in a museum drawer that anyone can examine and say, this individual still had fur, this one didn't. The transition from furred to bare left no physical trace anywhere in the archaeological or fossil record. So how do you even begin to date something that's essentially invisible to the evidence available to science? The answer came, strangely, from a gene that has nothing directly to do with hair at all. In 2004, researchers led by Alan Rogers at the University of Utah studied a gene called MC1R, which controls skin pigmentation. They found that a version of this gene favoring dark, protective skin swept through the ancestral human population and became nearly universal roughly 1.2 million years ago. The logic connecting this to hair loss is indirect, but it holds up. Dark skin only becomes a strong evolutionary advantage once you're walking around under direct, unfiltered sun without fur to shield you from it. If that pigmentation gene became essential and spread through the population around 1.2 million years ago, it suggests bare skin, and by extension, the loss of body hair, was already well underway by then. That's not a fossil. That's a genetic echo. A shadow of an event nobody was there to record, pieced together more than 1 million years later from the DNA of the people it happened to, read like a faint signature left on the only surviving witness, the genome itself. Even across that stretch of time, something never fully complied with the trend toward bareness. Human hair follicles never actually disappeared. This is easy to miss from the outside because it doesn't look that way. But researchers studying skin, including developmental biologist Sarah Miller at the University of Pennsylvania, have found that in sampled skin, humans carry a follicle density comparable to chimpanzees. The follicles are still there, spread across nearly the entire body. What changed wasn't the number of them. It was what came out of them. Across most of the body, thick, pigmented terminal hair got quietly swapped out for fine, nearly invisible vellus hair. The same soft, pale fuzz you can still find today if you look closely at the skin on your own forearm. Except in a few specific places: the scalp, the eyebrows and eyelashes, the armpits and the groin, and, in men, the face. Why those particular places kept producing terminal hair while the rest of the body was quietly downgraded to fuzz is a question researchers are still actively working out. Miller has said as much herself in her own research. Nobody fully understands why these specific patterns of retained hair exist where they do, or why the boundaries fall exactly where they fall. Some of them have a fairly obvious job. Scalp hair, for instance, plausibly shields the skull from direct sun exposure. Others are murkier and harder to explain with a single tidy story. And the beard is the murkiest of all, because it isn't really kept hair in the way scalp hair is. The follicles on a boy's face spend childhood producing the same fine vellus fuzz found across most of the body. It's only at puberty, under a surge of androgens, that those specific follicles convert to producing coarse, pigmented terminal hair. The face isn't a place fur refused to leave, it's a place where hair actively switches on later in life. That switch is driven by testosterone and its more potent derivative, dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. Well-documented, uncontroversial biology. What's genuinely contested is why evolution would install a hormone-triggered hair switch on the male face in the first place, in a species that had otherwise spent an enormous stretch of time moving in the opposite direction. We don't actually know whether this switch appeared around the same time as body hair reduction, long afterward, or on some entirely separate timeline. There's no genetic clock for beards the way there is for skin pigmentation. The honest answer is that the timing of beard evolution is simply unknown. What research has managed to test is not when beards evolved, but what they seem to communicate now. And that turns out to complicate the popular story further. The traditional assumption, dating back to Darwin himself, was that beards evolved because women found them attractive. Classic mate choice, the same basic logic behind a peacock's extravagant tail. It's a tidy story. It's also, according to the research conducted since, not especially well supported. A 2012 study by Barnaby Dixon and Paul Vasey found that bearded faces are consistently rated as older, more socially dominant, and more aggressive looking than the exact same faces shown clean-shaven. That finding has held up across follow-up studies by multiple research groups. A later 2016 study by Dixon and colleagues, this time focused specifically on attractiveness, found something messier on the mate choice side. Some women rated bearded men as more attractive, particularly when judging them for long-term relationships. Others showed no strong preference, or even a mild preference for the clean-shaven look. Heavy stubble sometimes outperformed a full beard in short-term attractiveness ratings. Put together, the honest summary is that the female attraction evidence is genuinely inconsistent, a real problem for a trait supposedly shaped primarily by what women wanted. What's consistent across nearly every study is how other men respond to a beard. Bearded men are consistently rated as more dominant and more aggressive looking. The studies measured perception, not actual behavior. Nobody has shown that a beard makes another man back down in real life. But that perceived formidability points toward a different kind of sexual selection than simple mate attraction. The kind aimed sideways at rivals rather than forward at potential partners. There's a small, almost accidental piece of supporting evidence for this idea, sitting well outside deep evolutionary time, in more recent human history. A demographic analysis of British facial hair fashions between 1842 and 1971 found that beards and mustaches became noticeably more popular in eras when there were more unmarried men competing for a smaller pool of available women. In other words, exactly the periods when male-to-male competition for partners was intensifying. This is a correlation drawn from Victorian and 20th century Britain, not proof of anything about the deep Pleistocene past, and it should be read as an illustration rather than deep time evidence. But it fits almost eerily well the same pattern the perception studies keep turning up. Beards doing their most reliable, most measurable work in contests between men, rather than in the eyes of the women those men were hoping to impress. None of this makes beard growth a clean, readable signal either. Beard growth depends on androgens, but a thick beard doesn't straightforwardly reveal a man's current testosterone level. How densely a follicle responds to those hormones varies enormously between individuals. So two men can carry very different hormone levels and grow strikingly similar beards. Or the reverse. There's also a second part of the naked skin story that hasn't been mentioned yet, because it happened far more recently, and it's dated by an even stranger method than a pigmentation gene. Lice. Human head lice and human body lice are technically the same species, but body lice live specifically in the fibers of clothing, unable to survive on bare skin the way head lice can. Since they could only have adapted this way after humans began wearing clothing habitually, researchers have used the genetic divergence between the two louse populations as a rough clock. A 2003 study estimated habitual clothing use at around 72,000 years ago, with a wide margin of error. A 2011 study using newer methods pushed that estimate back further, suggesting clothing was worn habitually at least 83,000 years ago and possibly as early as 170,000. However you read these numbers, they land many hundreds of thousands of years after that 1.2 million year mark for bare skin, meaning your ancestors spent an enormous stretch of time naked-skinned and without habitual clothing, long before either fabric or the beard's social meaning entered the picture. None of this makes the beards attract a mate explanation flatly wrong. It's entirely possible that beards do both jobs at once, imperfectly, depending on the culture, the context, and the individual man wearing one. But if you walked into this expecting a clean, symmetrical story, humans shed their fur because it was inconvenient, and then kept beards because people simply like them. The actual research hands you something considerably less comfortable. Hairlessness and beard growth aren't two sides of one tidy adaptation, solved together, wrapped up in a single evolutionary explanation. Their timing relative to each other isn't even known. What is known is that the beard's clearest, best replicated effect isn't on the people evolution supposedly built it to attract. It's on other men. Your hand goes back to your jaw, the stubble, or the smoothness, whichever it happens to be this morning. It's such a small thing. 2 seconds, most days, without a single thought behind it, barely registering as a decision at all. But underneath your fingers is a follicle doing something it doesn't do anywhere else on your body, waiting for puberty, waiting for a hormone, and then switching on. A patch of hair that evolution, for whatever reason, chose not to leave as fuzz. And the honest answer, the one the evidence actually supports, is that nobody, including the people who study it for a living, is entirely sure who it was ever meant for. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week, about ancient human behavior, about what your body still remembers, about the gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that is something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.